My guests are John Less, who's a local political figure, and Dr. Tim Cooper, who works at the University of the Fraser Valley. John was born and raised in Chilliwack and is well known for his political career, having served as an alderman, mayor, and chair of the Regional District Board during a long span. He was also the chair of the Fraser Valley Regional Library Board, a trustee with the Municipal Finance Authority, and an elected member of the Union of BC Municipalities. John also served on the board of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and served as president of FCM from 1995 to 1996. John was elected to the provincial legislature in 2001 and was re-elected again in 2005 and 2009. During his time as an MLA, he served as the caucus chair for 2 years, then was appointed to cabinet as the Minister of Small Business and Economic Development. Following this, he was appointed Solicitor General and Minister for Public Safety, and also served as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance and to the Premier. Now fully retired, John and his wife Maddie enjoy the blessings of 6 children who in turn are all married and have between them produced 21 grandchildren who the joy of their lives. There's many more awards and accolades I could talk about, but it's only an hour show. Dr. Tim Cooper was born in England, where he studied physics and math at Exeter University, coming to Canada to complete a PhD in nuclear physics at the University of Alberta. After temporary positions in Indiana, Triumph, McGill, Surrey University, he started his career at Ohio State University, then switched to the University College of the Fraser Valley when it started in 1992, later to become the University of the Fraser Valley. After teaching for many years and winning the Faculty of Science Teaching Prize in 2014 and publishing over 50 research papers in the field of intermediate energy nuclear physics, in 2004, Tim's attention switched to global warming and the dangers to his and all kids. Tim has given over 180 presentations on the science, economics, politics, and engineering of man-made climate change and the great danger he feels it presents in an attempt to sway public to listen to the scientists and to the science. In 2020, Tim ran for the BC provincial election for the Green Party of BC, where he received 10.68% of the vote, a solid outcome for a Green Party candidate. John and Tim are going to each take some time to present some of their views on the issue of climate change, and following their presentations, they will ask each other some questions, I will interject some questions, and we'll have a good discussion on what they've talked about. As always, I hope we come away with more knowledge than we came in with. That's the whole point. So gentlemen, the mics are hot. We've drawn lots to see who goes first, and Dr. Tim Cooper, you're up. Tim?
Thank you, Clint. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm speaking for 10 minutes just on the overall big picture of climate change as I see it. So without further ado, let me just jump into it. How did we get here is the question I'm going to be looking at the beginning. In other words, what's the history of what's been happening? And if you go back in the old science books, back in 1859, it was realized that carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere was trapping the sun's rays and making the Earth 32 degrees Celsius warmer than it would have ever been. So, in other words, the Earth is about 32 degrees Celsius warmer than the moon, which has no atmosphere. So that was interesting. Okay, 32 degrees. Back then, it was recognized that carbon dioxide is increasing. People were burning coal. Not many people, and not much coal, but a little bit. Carbon dioxide was building up in the air. So a Swedish chemist called Arrhenius thought, I wonder how warm it's going to get. So he said, let me do a calculation, because the laws of physics back then were fairly well understood. And he said, well, if we double the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, that's going from 280 parts per million up to 560, do my math right, he figured it would increase the Earth's temperature by about 4 to 5 degrees. And modern calculations that we have now, done on supercomputers, give pretty much the same answer. And the reason for that is the laws of physics that Arrhenius was using 125 years ago, and the ones we use today, they're the same laws of physics. As far as we can tell, the laws of physics haven't changed in 13 billion years. So it's no surprise that that actually is the case. Well, back then we had a small population, carbon dioxide was growing slowly, and nobody worried about it. It wasn't an issue. But that small population became a large population. That large population said, oh, well, I'm going to be using lots more coal and oil and gas, and carbon dioxide emissions increased enormously and carbon dioxide started to build up. Scientists were starting to say, ooh, this could be a problem one day, we've got to watch it. But everybody took what the scientists were saying at face value. The scientists thrashed it out in the scientific method involving refereeing each other's papers and trying to prove the existing science wrong, because that's what science is good at. And it passed all the tests. So nobody had any reason to doubt until not too long ago, the head of Exxon Corporation told his board, look, our scientists are telling us that if we keep emitting carbon dioxide, we keep, in other words, burning oil, it's going to be a major problem. And if the general public find out, it's game over for our industry. That was from the head of Exxon. He then started to work with the Koch brothers, who were barons of coal in the United States, and they created what we now call the skeptic industry or the denial industry. People to say, look, the scientists are not right. They haven't got it right, or they've cheated, or they haven't done things right, or they're motivated by trying to get research grants. Many different stories out there. But so whilst the science was settled 125 years ago within the scientific community, in the general community, it became very unsettled very quickly once Exxon and the Koch brothers got going. The situation today with global warming is, and global warming is slightly different from climate change. Global warming is that the Earth's temperature is going up. That's global warming. The temperature is about 1.1 degrees Celsius worldwide, warmer than it was in pre-industrial times. And it's still increasing at about 0.2 Celsius per decade. So if you just take those numbers, you can actually calculate roughly how hot it will be in the future. That increase in temperature is what I would call global warming. Climate change is a little bit different. It's saying that the climate is different now. The hotter the world is, we get more evaporation of water from lakes and streams and from forests, and that tends to dry the trees out, so we can expect to see more forest fires, and we do. But what goes up into the air in the form of water vapor must come down eventually, and when the air cools off with a lot of water vapor in it, we get a massive dump. So all over the world, we're seeing floods that we never used to see before. We're seeing rain, and as the rain comes down, the water vapor is converting to water prior to dropping. It releases something called its heat of transformation. So that region in the atmosphere suddenly gets warm, and that creates strong drafts. In other words, strong winds. So we're getting, here in the valley, we see it. Our summers are getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and our winters are getting wetter and wetter and wetter. But it's not just here, it's a global phenomenon. Another thing that's happened, which I would say is also climate change, is that the equator hasn't warmed up much at all, about 0.2, 0.3 degrees Celsius perhaps, but the North Pole, and therefore the South Pole too, have warmed up about 3 degrees Celsius. So the temperature difference between the equator and the North Pole has increased dramatically. Now that temperature difference is what drives the Earth's weather patterns. They drive the westerly winds, they drive the ocean currents as well. But that temperature difference is going down, and that's changing the Earth's circulation patterns. So that again is a change in weather patterns that we're seeing. And again, that's climate change. I was asked to talk about whether this is natural or not. And my answer is, well, humans are natural, so if we're doing it, it's got to be natural, but that's a cop-out, of course. Our carbon dioxide has increased in the past. We've seen that. The Earth has gone through 5 major extinction events, 4 of which are associated with carbon dioxide increases, and we have good records of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere going back 1 million years. Carbon dioxide is now increasing 200 times faster than anything in the records show. So if it was natural, it wouldn't be going up so fast. Moreover, our sun, over the long term, the sun is getting warmer and warmer. Stars do that. Okay? But our sun goes through, in the short run, little cycles of sometimes a bit warmer, sometimes a bit colder. And for the last 40 years, our sun has been easing off a bit, becoming a little bit less bright, a little bit less powerful, which normally would cause the Earth to cool. Moreover, our Earth's orbit keeps shifting on a regular basis every 100,000 years. And it's shifting now such that in about 2,000 years, we would have gone back into an ice age. Well, that means we should be cooling right now. So from the sun and from the Earth's orbit, we should be cooling, but we're warming. So yes, the only thing that can explain that is humans. So we're doing it. other question I want to talk briefly about is, should we be doing something about it? Well, yes, but we can't fix it overnight. This is a little complicated, but let me try it. If we were to suddenly stop all carbon dioxide emissions immediately, now nobody in their right mind would do that, except if I became king of the world, I would, but nobody else would. So what would happen? Will the temperature go down? No, it won't go down. Will it continue to increase? Yeah, it'll continue to increase at the same rate. But by stopping the carbon dioxide emissions, we will decrease the rate of increase of the rate of increase of the temperature. It's kind of complicated. Those of you who took science in school might remember the concept of a second derivative. So it's the second derivative of the temperature with respect to time goes down. So it's the rate of increase of the rate of increase that will decrease. That will very slowly bend the curve over, as we now say, and level the temperature out. So how could we do that? Well, here in Canada, we actually subsidize the fossil fuel industry. We've been criticized quite frequently on the world stage for doing so, and now I leave my comfort zone. I leave the science, I'm talking economics. I can just barely hang on, but bear with me. So we subsidize our fossil fuel industry by different amounts depending on who you speak to. I tend to go with the number from the International Monetary Fund. Those guys don't have any axes to grind, and they are the world's top economists. They have calculated that Canada subsidizes fossil fuels to the tune of about $40 billion US a year. That's 50 billion Canadian. Okay. So we are taking government money, taxpayers' money. We're taxing everybody, every business, every child. We're taxing them and giving that money to the fossil fuel industry, which I think is wrong. Now, how much does that work out? Well, if we look at Canada's emissions of carbon dioxide and divide one by the other, we find we're subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of $80 per tonne of emitted carbon dioxide. That's just dividing two numbers, so hopefully it's not controversial. We have a carbon tax in Canada. It doesn't apply as widely as I'd like to see it, but it's only $40 a tonne. So we subsidize $80 a tonne, we tax $40 a tonne. The net is a subsidy of $40 a tonne. So I would love to see us at least stop doing that. What would happen is that fossil fuel prices would go up, taxes would go down, our economy would do much better, because when you start taxing the whole economy and subsidizing one little piece of it, then you generally get a more healthy free enterprise economy. So we'd end up with a different world, a different country at least. We'd have a stronger economy, we'd have global warming leveling off eventually, and moreover, we'd end up with cleaner air. Most people don't realize, and this was a study done by the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, burning fossil fuels in Canada kills about 7,000 people a year. And if we scale that number for Chilliwack, about 20 people in Chilliwack die a year because of the burning of fossil fuels, fouling up the air, we breathe it in, heart disease, lung disease. We could clean up that air, it would be very good. So yes, we should do something about it, and I'd like to see something done about it very soon, because if we go too far into the future with global warming and warming, there are some feedbacks in the system which will prevent us from being able to stop it from going up all by itself afterwards. Okay, I've had my 10 minutes. I will stop.
Thank you so much, Tim, for those remarks. Our next speaker is John Less. John, over to you.
Thank you, Clint. I appreciate this opportunity to have what I think is a very important discussion between Dr. Cooper and myself. Bit of a disclaimer on my part. I'm just a guy who's been involved for over 30 years in public policy debates, discussions, decisions, and I've come to understand over all that period of time that the decisions that governments make are very, very important. If you look at just at the international level, for example, you have the two countries of Norway and Venezuela, both richly endowed with natural resources. Some intelligent decisions being made in Norway, not so much in Venezuela, and look at the difference that it has made in the welfare of the people in those two very disparate countries. So I think we need to be careful as a society and in the governments that govern us as to how we deal with this issue of climate change. That's first. Let me also say that climate change is not rocket science. It's much more complicated. It's a chaotic system, and I think it's appropriate for us to exhibit more humility than hubris when we discuss these issues, because I don't think any one particular individual has all of the answers. I certainly do not. The other thing that I have seen over the years is that there is a tendency to denigrate, for lack of a better word, people such as myself as deniers. I do not deny climate change. Climate change is a real thing. It has occurred throughout history. There is no denying that. So, when there's an attempt made to, shut off the debate, I'm often reminded of a fellow some centuries ago by the name of Galileo, who was a scientist. And with the prevailing theory back then being that the sun revolved around the earth, he challenged that and said, you know what, I don't think so. I think, in fact, the earth revolves around the sun. Well, for his trouble and the position that he put forward, he was denigrated, he was jailed, he was ostracized. He was eventually, of course, proven correct. I see some aspects of that kind of treatment going on in today's world. Science is not about consensus. And we often hear that today, the consensus is blah, blah, blah. I beg to differ. Consensus is, science is not about consensus. Science is about proving hard facts. So over the years, and probably 30, 35 years ago now, we first started to hear, about this debate, with some rapidity so as I've already said, we have learned over time that this is not a new debate. It's been going on for years and years and years. The climate has always changed. And when you read history, you can see that the climate has changed. If you read early American history, early Canadian history, you're struck by how cold it was in that time. And we've seen, if you go back a few thousand years ago, the Roman warm period cooled off in the Middle Ages. Then we had the medieval warm period. Then we had the Little Ice Age. And more recently, we've had another warming phase. The Little Ice Age distinguished itself that, in terms of the cold temperatures back then, had the Thames River in England, for example, freezing over and people skating on it all winter long. We have seen even more recently that extreme weather is not new. Now, some say, well, weather is not indicative of climate. Well, the two are certainly related. In 1970, for example, a major typhoon hit Bangladesh and 500,000 people perished. Speaking of typhoons, something that people in Chilliwack today, unless they happen to be here at the time, don't know, is that in 1962 we had a typhoon come right through the Fraser Valley. I remember the day well. We were sent home from school. We were out of power for quite a number of days. I am sure that if a typhoon came through the Fraser Valley in Chilliwack today, it would immediately be seen as evidence of climate change. But back then, we just saw it as, a big storm came through. So when you look at the last 100 years, we've gone from summer drought to geomagnetic storms to the Dust Bowls in the 1930s to fears about the coming ice age, which were publicly discussed in the 1970s, and then the more recent warming. And I think the media also plays a role. Extreme weather events have always happened. I can remember, well, I don't remember this, but my parents have told me this. In 1953, they were already living here, having recently emigrated from Holland. A major flood hit the part of the country where they came from, but it took 10 days before they had any knowledge at all as to who perished in that flood, and some of their family members drowned in that flood. Whereas just a week or two ago, we had a major rain event here in the Fraser Valley, and I was having lunch with someone just this afternoon, and his son's car had ended up in the ditch and was almost completely submerged. Somebody had taken a picture of that, and that picture went all over Europe, into Australia. It just illustrates how much more instant that kind of coverage is today, quite often leading to the perception that these extreme events are just much more in evidence today than they ever were before, when in fact that's not necessarily the case. I've often been taken aback as well by the distortions and hypocrisies that accompany the debate around climate change. For example, polar bears. We have probably all seen this picture of what we're being led to believe is the world's last polar bear clinging to that last little piece of ice. With the theme being, polar bears are facing extinction as a result of climate change. The truth of the matter is that the polar bear population is flourishing. They're not in trouble at all. We've heard claims in the past that the North Pole was going to be ice-free by the year 2015. Well, that didn't happen, and as we speak, the accumulation of ice at the North Pole in the Canadian Arctic this fall is actually a little bit above average. We also hear about ocean levels, that they're going to rise, and cities along the seaboard are going to drown, are going to be drowned out, while at the same time, of course, sometimes the very same celebrities that are avowing that climate change is a problem are buying oceanfront villas. I was struck, I think it was about 7-8 years ago, Hurricane Sandy in New York City. A major storm, to be sure, and I believe it killed 38 people, caused an amazing amount of damage. And it too was held up as being evidence of catastrophic climate change. I sat down one day and I simply Googled New York storms, and you get a very long list of storms that have roared through that area of the U.S. eastern seaboard, including New York City. You can find, for example, that in 1938 they had what they call the Long Island Express. It killed over 700 people, did an amazing amount of damage, and that was before the millions of people had moved into that area that are there today, and long before people had built out into the beaches around New York. The hockey stick graph that Michael Mann from the University of Pennsylvania came up with in the early 2000s, I found to be quite fascinating, and it certainly grabbed people's attention. And two Canadians by the name of McKittrick and McIntyre took it upon themselves to analyze the construction of this hockey stick graph. One of the things they did, as a good scientist would do, they asked Michael Mann for his work to see whether it in fact stood up to scrutiny. And to this day, Michael Mann has refused to release his work. To me, that is not a very scientific approach. His response was, well, all you're trying to do is debunk my work. Well, if it's debunkable, then it should be debunked. And so, nowadays you don't hear too much about the hockey stick graph anymore. It's kind of slowly disappeared. We're constantly being reminded by someone like Al Gore, for example, that, the apocalypse is nigh and we'd better do something about it. It would be a lot more believable if some of these celebrities, while they're touting, what we ought to be doing about climate change, would, live their lives accordingly. They do not. Al Gore has quite a number of houses. Leonardo DiCaprio, who famously thought that the Chinooks in southern Alberta were evidence of climate change. His yachts and his houses and his private jets are legendary. John Kerry, who's President Biden's climate ambassador, loves flying private jets all over the world. And when asked about it, he says, well, people like me, we have to, get around on private jets. Well, if we are living in a climate emergency, as these people would suggest we are, you would think that they would adopt a slightly different attitude. So, I've read, I think, quite widely about these issues, and I have tried to pay some attention to, credible people like Bjorn Lomborg, who's a Danish fellow who believes very strongly that CO2 is a problem, and we ought to be doing something about it. But if you read his most recent book, False Alarm, he is very careful to point out that while we are doing something about it, we should not beggar the economy, because an economy that is on the ropes is an economy in which the environment will suffer. So it's important to get that balance right. Dr. Judith Curry, who was a professor at Georgia Tech. She started out as being very much in the so-called mainstream of, climate alarm. But when she started doing more research, she came to be quite skeptical. And for her trouble, frankly, had to resign early from her position as a professor at Georgia Tech because of what she called an anti-skeptic bias in academia. Dr. Patrick Moore, he was the co-founder of Greenpeace. He's here from British Columbia. He has a PhD in ecology. He cares very much about the environment, but certainly is very skeptical about some of the assertions that are being made about climate change. And I would suggest, if people are interested in reading a book on the matter, his book called Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout is very much worth reading. More recently, a book by Dr. Steve Coonan called Unsettled is very much worth reading as well. Dr. Coonan was an official with the Obama White House dealing with climate. He's written this book, and I recently saw him speak as well. Makes a lot of sense. He's not a denier, but he's interested in a good evidence-based approach to these kinds of things. So, as I said, and I'll wrap it in a minute, the climate is changing. Yes, it is. It always has, and it is likely that CO2 is contributing to that change. It is also very likely that natural causes are contributing as well, the sun and other things of that nature. But while CO2 might be contributing slightly to climate change, there are also benefits to the additional CO2 in the atmosphere, and I look forward to perhaps discussing those a little bit more later on.
Those are two, I think, very informative presentations from our guests. We'll be back in just a minute, and we'll let them have at each other a little bit over the next section. Welcome back, everyone. Those were two great presentations by our guests today. I'm going to start with Dr. Cooper. Tim, what struck you from the things that you heard John say that you went, yeah, that's something I agree with, or there's something I think we need more information on, or that's BS. I'd be very interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, John actually had a lot of things. There's a lot to unpack, and I don't think I want to go through the whole list at this point in the debate. But I just couldn't help but notice you were talking, John, you mentioned Galileo, and the old picture was the Earth was stationary, the sun was going around it, and then it changed. You said where the sun is in the center and the Earth goes around it. I teach this stuff, and what I teach my students is that the Earth goes around the sun from the point of view of the sun, but the sun goes around the Earth from the point of view of somebody on the Earth. So it's a little bit more democratic these days than one or the other. So as long as you specify the observer, you can actually make both of them correct. But anyway, I heard what you're saying, and I completely agree with you. Climate is a chaotic system. Actually, a stronger statement would be weather, or slightly more accurate, I would say, weather is a chaotic system. Climate is the long-term average of weather over a long period of time at a large area of the Earth. That's the definition I'm using. Maybe you're using a different definition, and that's okay. That might be where we can differ on these things. So the chaotic nature of it, I'll take a moment to expound upon what John said there. It's classically represented by a thing that most people know as the butterfly effect. The idea is if a butterfly flaps its wings in Africa, it starts a little whirl going in the air, and that can grow exponentially until eventually it's a hurricane hitting Florida a few days later. So you can have massive changes caused by tiny stimulus. So one thing I have not been asked today anyway is, did climate change, did burning fossil fuel cause the flood in the valley? My answer is almost certainly yes. And that is such a misleading answer. Because what really happened was when the first person burnt the first lump of coal, they made a small change in the atmosphere. From that time on, propagating forwards in time to today, days that would have been pouring with rain might now be sunny. Days that would have been sunny might now be pouring with rain. The weather has totally changed. The only thing is, who's to say which one's better? Because we'd have this, if you have the same number of wet days and dry days, it's fine. Climate is the long-term average of that, though. So what we discover has changed is that as we go forwards, the overall Earth's temperature over the last, say, 50 years has been slowly and steadily increasing. Doesn't decrease during that time. It's been a very steady ramp up. So that is indicative of climate changing. Year by year, the temperature can go up or it can go down, but the long-term average is up. Okay? When it comes to things like storms, John, you raised an interesting issue. Before climate change, we still had massive storms. We still had floods. We still had problems. That's a weather phenomenon. The climate question is, are we having more of them today than we had in the past? And in order to answer that question, it takes a lot of research, far more so than I could put in. It takes teams of people to go through old weather records and try to find out how bad the storms were, how bad they are now, how much energy was in the storms then, how much energy is in the storms now. And the answer is that we are getting more floods than we used to. But that doesn't mean we didn't get honking great big floods in the past. So I just wanted to tie that little difference between weather and climate. So,
thank you. Let me stop, and I'm going to jump in, and I'll be doing this. What research is going on? My only research is having lived here since 1958, so I can look back on weather that I've seen that looked just like it did the last couple of weeks when we had massive rain, all of that. Where's the research, or is there research going on that's saying, are we experiencing more of that than we ever had? And because I think there's just, and maybe this is to John's point, there's a tendency for people to see a weather event like we had and say, oh, that's climate change. It's getting, like, without saying, yes, we've had, our average rainfall has gone up exponentially at the same rate that the Earth has warmed at the same rate as the same rate, which we can draw a conclusion to. Is that research going on?
That's done through the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's a massive group of top climate scientists get together every 4 years, and they bring out a review of all the literature, summary of all the research that's been done, and it groups into the pure science, the physics part of things. There's groups on the sociology, there's groups on the effect on crops. There's a whole bunch of subgroups of the IPCC that look into this. Yeah. So if you go to the IPCC report and read it, you're going to be very old by the time you've finished because it's really big. But yeah, that's where it gets done. And that's where it all gets reported. So I direct you that way.
And I think some of John's point, and I'm putting words in your mouth, John, and I'm loath to do that, is that we're not directed to that research enough. We've become believers or deniers, as it were, in this realm. And instead of saying, where do we go to get that information so that we can validate the things that we're concerned about or not, we simply now have become sort of a group of people that deny this is happening or believe it without even knowing where to go. John, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, when you mentioned the IPCC, they have put out reports from time to time as to the state of the climate. And as Tim has already suggested, it is a huge report. I wonder if anybody on Earth has ever read the entire report. What we get to digest is what's called a summary for policymakers, not written by scientists. It does put quite a different light on the actual research sometimes. It is written for politicians, unfortunately. That summary for policymakers, I would suggest, is not a scientific document. It is put out for public consumption without regard, and I've seen scientists complain bitterly that material that they had researched and written about and contributed to the IPCC report is nowhere reflected in the summary for policymakers, which is all that most people will ever read. So, so we have this steady increase of temperature going on, and that's been going on now probably since around 1850. And allegedly now that is being driven only by CO2. Well, I wonder then, how would someone like Tim explain the medieval warming, for example, when carbon dioxide was not an issue? Would natural causes have been the sole cause for the medieval warming? And would natural causes now have to be ruled out because we have this other agenda that, we wish to propagate, which is CO2? I would agree if we can move away from so-called fossil fuels into other cleaner fuels, that is a great thing to do. Absolutely no question. Even going from coal to oil to natural gas is already great progress. And as those opportunities present themselves, yes, we should do that. But we need to be careful. As I said before, if we're going to beggar our economy in the process, we're going to be environmentally going backwards.
So let's give Tim a chance to respond to that.
Okay, quite a lot there. So let me see if I can remember. Going back, you mentioned the medieval warming period. So I'll talk about that one first. If you look at a graph of average temperature of the Earth on a year-by-year basis, it's very hard to see the medieval warming period. It's really, really small. However, if you were living in it, it was quite real. And the reason that those two statements don't contradict is that the medieval warm period was limited to the region of the North Atlantic. And that's just a tiny area of the Earth. So with climate, if you're averaging over the whole planet, it really doesn't affect the average very much. It's a local phenomenon. So I introduced a dichotomy earlier, which is probably going to come back and haunt me, of having weather, which is something happens on a short time scale and a small geographic region, and climate, which is over a large region and a large time scale. But of course, the question is, what does small mean? What does large mean in this context? So in the context of the medieval warming period, it's certainly bigger than the Fraser Valley. It's a huge North Atlantic region, but that's still a small compared to the whole Earth. So there were reasons for the medieval warm period being at that time in that location. I don't know what they are. I haven't actually done that research to see. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a nuclear physicist, not a climate physicist. So I don't actually know, but CO2 was certainly not playing a role back then.
So let me jump in with something I've seen recently on the news, and it was the fact that I think some sort of plant has just been operationalized that's literally taking CO2 out of the air. Is technology the way forward? Here's my concern about Canada and climate change and carbon taxes and all of those things is we contribute so little. I mean, we've been accused of being, on a per capita basis, massive users or producers of CO2, but on the world scale, we produce very little. So whatever Canada does, if we have a drastic change in Canada, it's still going to make a minuscule change in the world. Is technology the way forward?
I would say, Clint,
John, sure.
I would say innovation. Perhaps more the description I think is apt here. We have a lot of technologies, and we have to use them in a way that is economically productive and environmentally beneficial at the same time. I think that it is tragic in some ways that we do not make better use of nuclear technology to produce energy. No emissions, very firm energy production, not the intermittent production that you get out of wind and solar, for example, which is a huge problem in Europe right now. Those are the kinds of power sources that we need, and the innovation that is now occurring with nuclear technology is that we're going to have smaller nuclear installations on a more distributed basis, which will increase our resiliency as well. Sometimes I marvel at the veritable thread by which the BC economy hangs, being the power lines that come from the Peace River and from the Revelstoke area down into the lower mainland. That's a pretty tenuous thing when you think about it. Wouldn't it be better if we had somewhat of a distribution of nuclear generation around the province in different areas, which would give us better energy security? And if we want to move forward into a future of more electric cars, for example, we're going to need an awful lot more electricity. And some of these other technologies, even natural gas generation, we can do that in an extremely clean way nowadays. The United States in the last half dozen years or so has seen a remarkable reduction in the emission of greenhouse gases. Most of that has been from the transition from coal to natural gas. So let's take that as a win, and then innovate from there on as we develop more clean fuels or sources such as nuclear power.
Well, we've got a nuclear physicist in our midst today. So, Doctor, it was on my list to say, what role is nuclear power going to play in reducing our reliance on burning old dinosaurs, as it were, to power our world?
I used to be one of the biggest supporters of nuclear. And to some extent, I still am. I'm not against nuclear power by any means. But the reason is that nuclear energy gives us electricity without any carbon dioxide emissions, which is great that way. I mean, there's tiny ones associated with the construction of the building and the digging up of the uranium, but that's minuscule compared to burning gas or coal. The reason I'm no longer quite so supportive is simply cost. Nuclear power brings in electricity at about 12 cents a kilowatt hour, but solar and wind have dropped so much in price. South Australia is now running at roughly 100% on average solar. And of course, I have to say on average because it's not doing much at night at all. It's doing a lot during the day. And then you store it. They're getting their electricity at 1.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So now you're asking me, would I prefer solar generating electricity at 1.5 or would I prefer nuclear at 12 cents a kilowatt hour? So to me, it's purely economics.
Yeah.
Nuclear has had its day. I'm a great believer in the free market. I may be the most right-wing person in Chilliwack in that regard. Let it operate. Because right now, the free market would move us towards wind and solar because it's cheap.
Is it still cheap in British Columbia? Is it still cheap, like South Australia? Absolutely.
Pretty sunny, isn't it?
352 days of sunshine a year. So is that a reflection of the cost that you have there?
Yes, it is. But you're right. If I put solar panels on my house, it's a lousy deal. First of all, because it's a small station and you don't have the economics of scale. But also it's cloudy a lot, so it's not as good here as it would be. On the other hand, I was driving from Kamloops to Cache Creek not too long ago. And all along that highway, there's bare mountainsides because it's basically a desert, south-facing. What a fantastic place for a solar farm. That would be similar. Oh, and there's a power line runs right alongside it too, which you can hook into. So why on earth aren't we doing this? Now, John raised a really good point about wind and solar. They're intermittent. Nuclear's not. So you need backup. Where could we get a battery big enough to store the solar energy and the wind energy for the night, in case the wind didn't blow at night? And the answer is we've got it already. The BC dams, the hydro dams. We're using those for baseload production. We should be building a whole bunch of wind and solar and then using the dams to regulate the energy flow. So when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, you run water through the dam. And when the wind is blowing like crazy and the sun is shining bright, you don't run water through the dam. We've already got the storage devices we need.
John wants to jump in. I can hear him.
It's interesting, and I'm sure there might be some wind or solar installations that actually work well and are economically viable. But the history has shown so far that solar installations, for example, whether it's in Medicine Hat or whether it's in California, the plant that was called Cylindra, which got over $500 million worth of subsidy, failed. The one in Medicine Hat was $12 million invested by the city. It's producing no power today. It's a failure. Wind farms. There's a large wind farm being constructed as we speak at Doggers Bank in England. I believe 180 turbines, if I'm not mistaken. And economists have taken a look at it and have determined that it has an economic net present value of minus $1 billion. So that doesn't tell me that there's anything financially sustainable going on here, and that it is not yet competitive. And as Tim has already pointed out, For every megawatt of wind power or solar power that you put in place, you need the equivalent amount in backup. That is, I think, one of the biggest arguments against wind and solar, because basically you have to double up in case the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine. And that's not only at night. Europe has just gone through several months of where the winds were very quiet for whatever reason that I haven't researched. But and it's led to, you know, they're drawing down their reserves of natural gas in particular, to the extent that they might now be facing a very cold winter because their natural gas reserves are down. And then geopolitically, of course, who's controlling that tap right now but Vladimir Putin. So there are those kinds of considerations as well. The energy security of each of those individual countries is also, I think, an important factor to consider.
Tim?
Yeah, I heard about Slidra. It was a most unfortunate tale, for sure. One thing about the wind and solar, especially solar, is that you're correct when you say look at the history of it and it doesn't look so good. I completely agree with that. But if you go back just 10 years, wind and solar was so much more expensive than it is now. The technology has developed enormously. And wind and solar today is nothing like what it used to be 10 years ago.
Yeah, can I just interject there, though, especially when it comes to wind? You know, when you look at one of those turbines, and you get up close to them, they are massive. And I made a few notes in terms of, you know, there's 200 tons of steel in each one of those turbines. There's over 200 cubic meters of concrete in each one of those turbines. The blades are made of fiberglass resins and plastics. There's 5.5 tons of copper in each one of those turbines. All of that for roughly 3 megawatts of energy generation. And here's an interesting thing. Some years ago, they quit using PCBs as lubricants. Today, they use a compound called SF6, which is a gas, sulfur hexafluoride. From a heat trapping perspective, it is 23,000 times more potent than CO2.
That is per kilogram, I assume.
I beg your pardon?
That's per kilogram? I'm assuming, because there's much less of it than there is of CO2. But yeah.
Comparing, you know, equal to equal.
Yeah.
So, you know, I would say from a heat trapping perspective, if that is the concern, it is a much more it's a very dangerous substance to be using. You know, they've done some calculations that the emissions of that substance alone today is equivalent to the burning of 113 million tons of coal annually. And that's without any reliable reporting from China, India, and Korea in terms of how much of that substance they are using. So my point is simply this. We need to be careful sometimes when we salute a technology like wind and say it is the be-all and the end-all, and I haven't even started about all the avian life that is killed by these things. You know, we need to be very careful to consider all factors. And I think when you do, there's still a lot of questions to be raised by wind and solar.
And here I think, Tim, you would agree with this, that where we go wrong sometimes is that governments get involved. They don't let the marketplace make the determinations. So if government gets involved and says, we're going to subsidize the oil industry, then the oil industry says, yeehaw, let's go forward, and they're producing cheap power. If the government says, we don't want to do that because it's not politically appropriate or acceptable, so let's subsidize the wind industry, we can end up in the same kind of situation. So where is the answer in your mind? I'm leading you into we should let the free economy try to do this, but is there an answer there? Or are governments always going to manipulate these based on political considerations?
Well, I'm in a room with two experienced politicians, so if you're asking me what politicians are going to do, yes.
Former politicians, and there's a good reason.
Recovering politicians, is that the phrase?
That's the phrase, yes it is.
Yeah, but everybody has their own idea of this, and I'll share my idea, but I can't say it's the best idea or the only idea. Which, when I look at it this way, I drive an electric car. I know, Clint, you do too. It emits far less carbon dioxide or global warming gases over its lifetime than a gasoline-powered car would. Slightly more greenhouse gases are released in the manufacture of the car, but the actual use over the years, it's much less. So how did I choose, or how did you choose to do that? Was it the goodness of our hearts, or was it something else? I'd like to claim it was the goodness of our hearts, but who knows? What motivates people often is their wallet. It really is. And if you want people to, if you worry about the climate, encouraging people to drive electric cars is not going to happen is not going to help at all. And I need to unpack that statement. So encouraging people to drive electric cars does not help the climate. But encouraging people to not drive gasoline-powered cars, that helps. And those two are not the same. So if you simply make gas more expensive, gasoline that is, and you then say, okay, it's more expensive, everybody will try to find a way around paying for that gas. Some will go electric car, some will go electric bike, some will go on the bus, some will go carpool, some will walk. I mean, some will work from home. So by putting, we don't know, I would claim, especially the government doesn't know, what's the right thing to do. But we know exactly what's the wrong thing to do. So instead of trying to subsidize the right thing to do, just tax the wrong thing. Let the individuals sort themselves out. That's what I believe in. And John, if I could jump in. John, you mentioned technology. And I'm a big fan of technology. In fact, it was my job for many years. But technology doesn't get developed unless there's a profit motive. It really doesn't. So to get technology to go, you've got to have a problem you solve. So once you have, say, an extremely expensive transportation system, a whole bunch of entrepreneurs are going to start thinking, how can I get from A to B cheaper? And how can I sell this product? So necessity is the mother of invention. We have to build that necessity.
I
John,
think this
you
probably,
get the last word on this, and then we've run over time. The director's going crazy in the booth, but it's been fascinating and I think very informative. I'll give you the last word, and then I'll wrap up.
Tim and I could probably agree on this, that if all subsidies were removed, it would be a better system. Let people make intelligent choices based on all of the facts being at their disposal. I think that's important. I often, this debate goes on about internal combustion engine versus an electric car. And I've often said, back in the day, about 100 years ago now, when Henry Ford started building the horseless carriage, I'm not aware that there were any subsidies at all. But people liked the horseless carriage because there was nothing coming out the back end that stank and created disease in their cities. So people flocked to the Model A and the Model T and what have you, simply because it was in their interest to do so, and it cleaned up their environment, and there were no subsidies involved. So in a more perfect world, I would agree with you. The subsidization of any of these options should be withdrawn and let people make intelligent choices based on their self-interest, which they have a habit of discovering without too much help from government.
Thank you so much. And listening to both of you, you probably on a good day would recognize that there's so much that you agree on, and yet I think people looking afar might say, oh, those are two guys that wouldn't agree on very much. And I think, in fact, as we have these kinds of discussions about these kinds of issues, we discover that there's very much that we do agree on, and there's very much that we can build from as we move forward, making Chilliwack and the Fraser Valley in British Columbia, Canada, and in fact the world a better place. And if we've even done a little bit to move that forward, I'm very happy. This discussion, I think, has been informative and enlightening. I hope John, you and Tim enjoyed this as much as I did, and I hope the folks watching at home enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much. This is an episode of Hames Hot Mic. We'll be back with another debate of this type very soon.